Hi everybody, so this is the last of the tutorials in our 2021 series, and it is my final words of advice for you ahead of your external exam on Monday. So across the course of the tutorial series, we have broken this play apart. We have thought about the way stylistic features work together to build a play. We have used the language and learnt the language associated with both the construction of a play and then the analysis of one. We've looked at the characterization and the thematic development of Macbeth specifically. And we've also looked at all the different strategies we can put into place to ensure that the process of writing an analytical essay is as efficient and as well developed as it can be. In our last video, we looked at the feedback from our mocks, and we, I think, can all appreciate the benefit of taking some time to work, to have a clearly established process and to work through that process from the very moment you read the question to the final full stop in your essay. The biggest thing I can remind you of from our feedback from the mocks is, of course, to read the question and to deconstruct it properly. So the final bit of advice that I want to give you is to remind you of the importance of the text-context relationship. Or what I mean by that is the way in which the text, in our case Macbeth, is the conduit through which we have a conversation with the author. I find it incredibly reassuring that we each can have a conversation with Shakespeare over 400 years and in different continents, with different language tools and with a different social structure, and still make meaning. And the reason that we can still have a conversation with Shakespeare and take some meaning from the message that he wanted to pass to an audience then, but we receive it as an audience now, is because that text is such a specific construction of what it means to be human. So it doesn't matter that it's a story about a king. It doesn't matter that there are witches. It doesn't matter for us that we fight with swords. The messages of the play, the tragedy of the play, is inherently human. And we could just as easily depict that with 3 garbage men rather than 3 witches, with guns rather than swords, and with the CEO rather than a king. So the roles that people play matters less than what it means, what Shakespeare has done to make them human. Okay, so the focus of this is on the text-context relationship, and specifically how much of that has to go into the building of your thesis. I want to stress that if you can ensure that there is reference both to the stylistic components of the text, so the things that are in the text, and an analysis or an identification and evaluation of the ideas that exist outside the text, and which are presented inside the text, your thesis is going to be meaty enough for you to be able to write a really good essay. Okay, if we focus just inside the text or just outside the text, it's going to lack sufficient depth to be able to evaluate the effectiveness, the extentness, the significance of whatever it is that you wanted to explore. All right, so we're going to have a look at a little PowerPoint that I've constructed specifically around the text-context relationship. And we're going to look at what we need to understand about that in the construction of a thesis, in the deconstruction of the question, and then in the construction of a thesis and in the planning of our essay. All righty, so let's open this up and we'll jump back up. Okay, so essentially the text-context relationship is that relationship between the world of the author, so that's everything that is behind the text. Those of you who are from SOR might be familiar with the language of behind the text. And the influences on the author include things like their age, their gender, their education, their race and their exposure to other races, their religion and their exposure to other religions, the way that society is structured, the impact of the economy on the society, and even things like world events. Now, another thing that would be of particular relevance to, say, Jacobean era would be celestial events, things like eclipses or the appearance of comets, because while we now recognize those as entirely astronomical events, they would have been given astrological significance at the time that Shakespeare wrote. So we've got to think about we've got to give ourselves a little bit of a history lesson and give it a bit of a historical framing to understand why those things would have mattered, or rather how they mattered, and then what message we can still take from that. So the author is behind the text. The text is this box over here, and that is the conversation. That's the conduit. That's the phone message. That is the way that we are actually learning what it is that Shakespeare wants us to take from this text. Now, every single text in the world is a construction of the author's experiences with the intention to communicate with the audience. And so there is a deliberate manipulation of the construction of a text to have that conversation. So we know that we can read a novel about war, and we can read a poem about war, and we understand that the subject matter is the same, but the deliberate construction of those texts using stylistic devices and aesthetic features, focusing on a particular point of view, or including or omitting particular bits of the content, will position us differently. And we know that that's the case. We've already done an analysis of texts on the same topic this year, and we can see that those texts would be the same text if it weren't for the deliberate manipulation of those components. So when we think about what's in the text, we have to think about the fact that the author, in this case Shakespeare, constructed these characters, constructed this setting, wrote these words to convey a particular message to the audience. And so they don't just exist by accident, they're there very purposefully, and you can talk about them very purposefully. When we think about what's in front of the text, well, that's us. In front of the text is the audience's experience. And we are not all equally matched in our ability to accept an invited reading. And that has nothing to do with our ability to read or our education. That can actually be about our exposure to language. It can be about whether we actually come from a completely different set of values, attitudes, and beliefs. And therefore, when we see the depiction of a particular character, we can't see ourselves in that character. It makes no sense to us to recognize them as the hero or the heroine. Okay, so when we think about the relationship between the author via the text to the reader, we have to think about how our background might be different from the author's, and therefore why that might influence the meaning that we make. And so you might have noticed on this previous slide, there are asterisks next to each of these particular little references. So behind the text, in front of the text, and of the text. And so just to unpack those asterisks a little more, we have this next slide. So we know that when we are referring to the world of the author, the behind the text, we are thinking about the way in which Shakespeare chooses to represent Jacobean values. And when we are wanting to refer to the influence of the author's world on the text, we can say things like, Jacobean expectations of women are challenged by Lady Macbeth when. So that's outside the text. Jacobean expectations of women are influenced or are challenged by Lady Macbeth. So that's now drawing us into the text. And then we would give a specific example of how her behavior challenged Jacobean expectations. And in doing that, we can actually see that if she challenges them over and over again, it's unlikely that a Jacobean audience, particularly of men, is going to see her as a good character, as a heroine, as someone worth saving. So that's not because she's not worth saving. That's because the dominant ideology, which is going to influence the majority of the audience, is going to see her as problematic. When we think about the audience's experiences, as I've already mentioned, we've got to think about how our responses or how our experiences differ from the authors, but also how they are linked by the universality of being human. Okay, so I might not ever be burned at the stake for speaking out, but I can appreciate the marginalization of women. I might never be left out in the cold because I was born left-handed, but I can appreciate the ways in which I have appeared accident prone because the world is geared towards right-handers. So in both cases, there's a universality of suspicion about difference. There's a universality of the use of power and the use of manipulation. And I don't need to be called a witch to understand the bigger picture. But we need to know that that's what's being used in the text so that we can actually analyze it. So then when we're in the text, here's one thing that I really want you to understand. It is important that you name the stylistic device. You will not get any marks if you simply say, Shakespeare uses stylistic devices to position audiences. That is a statement of fact. You have not analysed anything. So that's identification as a cognitive verb. It is important that you name the stylistic device, characterization. It could be the use of a monologue. It could be juxtaposition. You then give an example and you explain the impact. Shakespeare uses the characterization of Lady Macbeth when she calls on the spirits to strip her of her femininity, to position the audiences to see her as unnatural. Okay, so you see how I've connected the dots there. It's important that we think that everything has been constructed and that it's a representation of ideas. So it's not, we can't say every character in Scotland behaved like Macbeth or every character in Scotland behaved like Macduff, because it's not true. But we know that they're representations of that. Okay, so there are two techniques, literary techniques, that would be of particular relevance to you if you're trying to actually look at the impact of values, attitudes, and beliefs and how they actually appear in a text. So the first of those is an allusion. So when we think about allusion, we're talking about a reference to prior knowledge. And when we talk about a reference to prior knowledge, we're assuming that an audience knows that something was significant. And that could be a reference to the Greek or Roman gods or to Christian mythology. And just being able to know what it means already means that the author has saved time. So it's a bit of a cheat to cut down on having to explain stuff. So allusion is a reference to the prior knowledge, and simply by using it, we are saying it's like this. My situation, same. The second one, though, the one that actually is of great use to you as an analyst, is the idea of connotation. So connotation is when the use of that allusion, the use of that prior knowledge has meaning attached to it. And normally when we refer to connotation, we say that something has positive or negative connotations. And essentially that means that it carries, those words carry cultural or emotional implications, cultural or emotional power. And by using them, again, the author has created a shortcut and has said, because I've used this word, feel this. Okay, so here are a couple of examples. So in the first dot points, we have two examples of allusion. I wish I could just click my heels. So, you can see that the references to the text are in the brackets afterwards. We know it's from The Wizard of Oz. We understand the references to being able to click our heels together, a very, very simple action, and suddenly be home. So when we use an allusion like that, we want to be able to say, I wish I could just do something really easy, really quick, something I could have always done, and my job, my hard work is over. In the second one, if I'm not home by midnight, my car might turn into a pumpkin, is again an allusion to the Cinderella story. We get the idea that it's that I'm changing. I will change after a certain point in time, and that I need my audience to understand that I'm going to change, and therefore understand why I'm going to hurry. Okay, so that allusion helps to put a time frame on my story. Slightly different, though, is then the value attached to these references when we think of them as a connotation. So look at the second two then. His smile is like kryptonite to me. So first of all, we have to understand the reference. We get that it is a reference to Superman and to the weakness that the minerals of his home planet, Krypton, cause in the human atmosphere. And if you're a real comic book tragic, you know that there are different kinds of kryptonite. In this example, however, we're not expected to just connect to the idea of DC Comics and Superman and his home planet and kryptonite. We understand that the word kryptonite is linked to weakness. So by referencing the word here, that the word kryptonite has connotations, it has emotional power. And by using it, I'm saying I am made weaker by, in this instance, someone's smile. But it could be that the laugh of a baby is kryptonite, that I'm weak as a result of hearing a baby laugh, or it could be anything. It's the word that has the power. This one, the second one, is really obvious. We probably have even used this one ourselves. We know when we refer to someone's Achilles heel that we are picking up on the allusion to a character from Greek mythology, the story of the fall of Troy, and this great hero who fought with Agamemnon's forces, and his incredible military prowess was attributed to the fact that he had been made impervious to pain and harm because his mum had dipped him in the river Styx. And there was one point of his body that could still be weak, and that was his ankle, because that's what she held on to when she dipped him into the river. When we use the word Achilles heel, we are not necessarily actually suggesting that you have to know all about the river Styx and the battle of Troy, the fall of Troy, whatever. What we understand, again, is a tiny chink in your armor, a reference to a weakness, and that has emotional power. So an example from the text might be when Lady Macbeth says, I have known what it is to nurse a babe, and if I had so promised, I would dash his brains out. Now, she makes an allusion. She draws on an allusion in her conversation with Macbeth. I have known what it is to nurse a baby. Okay, so something that they have both shared and which was important to both of them. She then manipulates the emotional power of that allusion by saying, but I would dash that baby's brains out if I had promised to, the way you had promised to kill Duncan. So this is not actually ever about Lady Macbeth killing a baby. It's about her saying, I can use the power of something that's of great emotional significance to us to show you how important this promise was. Okay, and it might be the same as, me saying, I would burn my collected works of Shakespeare if I had promised to, the way you have promised me. And we all know that Mrs. Mac is not going to burn her collected works of Shakespeare unless it's a pretty serious situation. All right, so then there are lots of references to things like death in our play. But each of these, if you look at them, we know that they're all references to death, but look how different the words are. Each of these words has very specific connotations. So the use of something like murder, we see it as a crime, and we probably might think it's maybe violent, but it doesn't have to be. Butchery, however, we can see is very much about an aggressive action, and we expect that there'd be blood. Execution has a different feel. That seems more clinical, a little bit more distant. And Golgotha would only work if you understood the reference from the Bible. And this is the place where Jesus was crucified. So here we have the idea of sacrifice. So depending on the words that you use and depending on the words that Shakespeare has used, you're actually able to provide a really nuanced analysis of what he was trying to say because of the power of the words that he's used. So why is this all relevant? Okay, so we talked about the idea of your thesis statement having to include both references to what happens outside the world, to the big ideas, and also references to something inside the text. In this question, we were asked, this is the one from our analytical essay guided tutorials, you were asked, how is the reader invited to view the concept of disorder in society in Macbeth? So the concept of disorder in society exists outside of Macbeth. It happens in the real world. We saw the concept of disorder when people were hoarding toilet paper. We could see confusion and panic and aggression, and that's disorder. Okay, so the concepts exist outside the text, but this question was asking us specifically to look at how that concept is presented in the text. So your thesis has to connect the two. You have to have an idea of what the concept is in the real world, and then how it is presented in the play. And your thesis then needs to tell the audience, or tell the marker, about how the audience is positioned to see it. So the audience is positioned to see that the concept of disorder in Macbeth is as a direct result of his selfish actions. So I've said disorder comes when people are selfish. Well, we can probably argue that that's pretty true. We've seen lots of examples of it in the last 18 months. So what I then did is I have taken a sample paragraph, which was a paragraph written in response to the essay question, the previous essay question, and shared with Downland students in your handout and on our Padlet. And this particular annotated paragraph here shows both references to author's purpose and author's manipulation. Those are the references in green. Concepts that exist specifically inside the play, and also concepts that exist outside the play. So the words in red reference character traits that exist in the real world: being chivalrous, being heroic, making a commitment, having morality. The references in yellow refer specifically to the way that the text is put together, to play with those very ordered concepts and the fact that they're lost in the play. So his selfish decisions, his hamasha of ambition, his insecurity leads to his downfall, his tragic downfall. And then the green references the idea that the audience is positioned to see that the impact of one person who had power making selfish decisions actually has widespread influence over the entire kingdom. And that would be true of any of us. We just have slightly less influence. So we don't make quite as much of a mess when we act selfishly, but we do have more localized damage. So you can take the time to read that paragraph and to think about how it is that even in your own writing, you can show the connection between context and text at the thesis writing level, and then at each of your paragraphs. You might even like to go back through your mock and see if you can highlight values, attitudes, and beliefs, so context references and text references, and see if you've actually made the connection, because that is something we can all strengthen. Okay, so we've only got about 72 hours before our external exam. And if you're looking for what it is that you need to do, by this stage, you have revised. You have revisited your key quotes. You know these characters and you know how they change. You probably just need to practice the deconstruction of questions. I would urge you all using either the questions that we have already given you, ones that have been shared on other Facebook pages, or if indeed you want to write to me and ask for a question, I'll provide you with one. Go through that process of making sure that you can construct a thesis that actually has contextual references, the values, attitudes, and beliefs, and the text references, so the stylistic components like characters or themes or symbols, and offer an evaluation about the effectiveness. So how effectively has Shakespeare communicated with me through the text? Okay, I'll say that again. How effectively has Shakespeare communicated with me about what it means to be human through the text? Right? Pose that question to yourself when you plan. How effectively has Shakespeare communicated with me about this issue through the text? All right. It has been a great pleasure to prepare these tutorials for you. I do wish you all the very best of luck. As you know, your English teachers will not be in the EA with you because they are not allowed to supervise the subjects that they teach. Stay true to yourselves. Stay true to all the planning you've done. And if in this last 72 hours you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. I'm only too happy to spend some time revisiting and revising anything that you might need. But for the last time, see you later.